Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 301. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And today I am here with Philadelphia's own Josh Vogel. Josh, how's it going, sir?
So far, so good, Steve. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I am glad to have you here, man. Maybe do a quick introduction. Tell people about who you are, where you train, and how they can find you.
So my name is Josh Vogel. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I've been doing jiu-jitsu for about 21 years, I guess. And my wife, Angie, and I own a school in Philadelphia called the Jiu Jitsu Company. We opened that about 3 years ago, and here we are. We focus a lot on organized jiu-jitsu at our school. So it sort of shows up a lot in the class structure and the curriculums and some of the specialized classes we do.
So let's talk about that for a second. When you say organized jiu-jitsu, man, that sounds really appealing to me.
I'm getting that sense.
But what exactly do we mean when we say organized jiu-jitsu? How would your work differ from other gyms down the street, for instance?
Well, basically the way that I came up in jiu-jitsu, and I think a lot of people had this experience, was you go to class, you learn what seems to be a random technique or two, and then you roll. And then if the technique shows up during open mat in your training, cool. And if it doesn't, then it's just sort of lost to the whirlwind of time. So the problem that I had when I first started training was just that I have a hard time learning in a disorganized way. And so what I started doing was taking okay, if I learn an arm bar, how can I connect that? Like I'm doing an arm bar from close guard, for example. I try the arm bar, they pass my guard, I'm on bottom of side control. Then that means that I have to have a way of getting out of side control. And then you keep on adding links to the chain. And then what I ended up sort of discovering over time was that, well, if I can have a plan from bottom of side control and have a plan for close guard and have a plan for top of side control, etc., then I don't have to memorize all the jiu-jitsu in the world. I just have to have my own Josh Vogel brand of jiu-jitsu that I can focus on and then have a plan for everything that happens during a roll instead of just kind of slapping hands, fist bumping, and then throwing the dice and seeing what happens. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it kind of does. I'd be curious to know, how do you put something like that together, especially in a regular jiu-jitsu class where you're going to have a big cross-section of students, all with different games, different skill levels? How do you come up with a plan for everyone all at the same time? That sounds like probably a big amount of work there.
Well, so for example, in my school, we have technical classes where we work on specific curriculums for 4 to 6 weeks. And then we have classes where students can kind of guide their own learning. And then I help them with their own personal projects. And then the belt promotion standards that we use is a way of guiding the students to sort of giving them like a template that they can follow for their own personal jiu-jitsu. So for example, if you're a white belt and you sign up at our school and you've been around for a year, year and a half, 2 years, and your goal was to get to a blue belt level, then the blue belt promotion standard is having a minimum of one technique from every major position, top of side control, bottom of side control, some kind of guard position, top and bottom, a standing technique for takedowns, etc. So it's not that I require them to learn okay, you must learn X choke and armbar from closed guard, and you have to learn single leg and double leg from standing. It's that if you know what to do when you're standing and you have a sense of what to do from all the major positions, then that's what I would like to see as you're working towards blue belt. And then for them to pick those techniques for themselves, they have the fundamentals curriculum that we use, which gives them sort of ideas of what they could pick for themselves. And then if there's something that isn't in the fundamentals curriculum or doesn't work for them and they need their own personal, like, okay, I can't do any of that stuff, or I don't want to do any of that stuff. What is something that I can do that resonates with me personally? Then we have that personal projects class where I help guide them on their own personal projects that help lead them through the belt promotion process. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. Do you find that that is a gigantic commitment of time and effort from yourself as the instructor? I would think that if you're having to kind of tailor your class, do you find that that's something that as an instructor is a challenge just due to the time commitments involved? I can imagine that if you've got a whole bunch of students all with different games and you're trying to help them optimize around their own, it seems like the kind of thing that gets difficult to manage as your classes and your gyms get bigger and build up more.
Yeah, it's definitely a full-time task. So we have go back and forth between about 150 to 200 students. And so I have a number of instructors on staff who follow the same sort of recipe that we teach at our school. And so I try to get contact with every single student so I can help guide them in some way. But if I can't give enough attention to, for example, people in fundamentals classes, or if there's people that I'm not able to see that often because maybe they train on days where I'm not in, then I have my instructors that kind of help fill in some of those gaps. But I do try to make sure that I roll with every single student as much as possible and make contact with them and try to give them advice on their own personal game. And it is a lot, but the way that I feel about it is that I do jiu-jitsu full time. So it's sort of my job to do that. And if I wasn't doing that, it's not like I'd be doing anything else anyway. So
makes sense. Now, I got to ask, if you're like me and a lot of other instructors, you probably have a hell of a time remembering everyone's name. It's got to be hard to not just remember their name, but also their entire jiu-jitsu game and where they were at and what they were working on. Is that something that you track somehow, or do you kind of keep all of this in your head at the same time? I'm just sort of wondering logistically, how do you manage all of that information about your students? Do you have like a system where you write this down, or do they have to keep reminding you and refreshing you, or is your memory just so good that you can remember exactly where you left off every time?
So it's a little bit of all of those things. So there are some people that, I'll send myself an email and I'll say, Harry is working on using the cradle to pass half guard. And I'll just bookmark that for myself because I know that if I don't get a chance to see Harry this week, I might forget that that's what he's working on. But for the most part, I'm pretty good at remembering what people are doing because I try to train with everybody as much as possible. And when I'm training with them in such a way where I'm constantly accessing what they're working on. So for example, I'm not rolling with my students and then just trying to smash everybody with my own game. I'm rolling with Harry and I'm trying to play bottom of half guard so he has a chance to work on his cradle from half guard and I have a chance to fight that and give him some problems to look at. And I'm rolling with Sui and she's working on her guillotine from standing position, so I try to play that position with her. So I spend a lot of time training with my students and playing the positions that they're working on so that they have a chance to practice that stuff against somebody who's more experienced than them. And also it gives me a chance to it's like a mnemonic almost, when you're trying to remember people's names, for example, the more you say their name or the more you make their name rhyme with something else, the easier it is to remember. So when I roll with them and I put myself in their positions, it makes it much easier for me to remember what they're working on because I remember, Harry almost guillotined the hell out of me when he was doing his cradle position from half guard. Does that make sense?
Harry's got a pretty good guillotine.
He does.
That does make sense. I'd love to know, though, when you're out of the mats or when someone else steps in for you, how does that person kind of know to pick up where you left off? Because if everything is being kept in your head, then that assumes that you're the person that's training with students. If you're kind of working with someone on their game, you step away, some other instructor comes in and rolls with them. Do you have a way of handing that knowledge off to that other person? Or is it kind of a thing where every instructor has their own relationship with the student?
Exactly, yes. So I teach the majority of the advanced classes and my wife teaches classes and we have a number of other instructors, I think 5 or 6 other instructors that are teaching classes as well. And so we all make sure to connect with all of the students as much as possible. And then we all talk to each other pretty regularly. For example, if I'm talking to, I talk to my wife every day, but if I'm talking to let's say Mikhail, he's one of our other instructors, he'll tell me, oh, this person is doing really well working on their arm drag inside trip from standing. And he'll kind of help guide them a little bit with their projects and give them feedback. So all the instructors that I have are very good about making personal connections with all the students and then making sure that they're aware of everybody's game. And so if I can't get to every single person with as much depth as I would like, I know that they're on top of it too. And we all communicate with each other all the time about it.
Got it. Now, your method, you've described it before as project-based jiu-jitsu, and I'd love to hear more about that, what that means to you, what the name means, and how this actually all ties together. So when we say that we're doing project-based jiu-jitsu, is that what we've talked about here so far today? Are there any more details that we need to wrap into that?
Yeah, so we've touched on it a little bit. So basically, project-based jiu-jitsu is, you know how when you get on the mat sometimes and somebody says, "What are you working on?" And you go, "I'm working on arm bars right now." And that's kind of like, that's the most basic form of having a project. It just means that your spotlight is on a certain part of your jiu-jitsu. And then you have to build, like for me, again, I mentioned that I'm really into organizing jiu-jitsu. And I think, based on what I've seen from BJJ Mental Models, the premium service, it seems like you're, kind of the same sort of guy. With organizing that, it's like, okay, well, if I want to work on arm bars, what does that mean? Does that mean that I just go spam arm bars on all my training partners during open mat? And that's one way to do it. But then the problem is that you really can't track the problems that you're coming across, and you don't know why the arm bar fails if it fails, or you don't know why you're successful if the arm bar is successful, and you have no way of measuring your progress in the arm bar. So project-based jiu-jitsu is a way of basically organizing that armbar project into, maybe over the course of 90 days or 4 to 6 weeks, I'm going to take that armbar and I'm going to work on entries. I'm going to work on ways to control the armbar position. I'm going to work on finishing mechanics, and I'm going to study each of those topics in a specific way so that you can understand clearly what the problems you're coming across are, brainstorm solutions intelligently, and then make measurable progress on that armbar project.
Got it. Something you've said here, which really resonates with me, is not just teaching people a technique, but giving them a whole sequence around that technique that they can use so that they can get into that technique, into the situation where they could do that move, and also a plan B, what to do if the technique either fails or if the opportunity to use it doesn't materialize. This is a big deal because I think in so much of jiu-jitsu, the way that people teach, they show one individual move in a bubble, and then their students maybe think that it's either a do it or don't thing, where you can go for it and you can get it or you don't, but they don't realize that a technique is part of a broader ecosystem. And then some teachers try to improve the thinking by building that into a sequence, and that's a bit better, but then that sometimes erroneously makes students think that the sequence is this one thing that lives in a bubble. And in reality, very rarely do things go according to plan. Very rarely can you say these 10 steps are going to happen, because you've got an unwilling, resisting opponent who's trying to shut down your game while you're doing what you're doing. So I like the idea of taking something that you're working towards and making it a project where you're kind of building out a whole plan for how to make this technique work, how to make this move work. It's not just about the move, it's about all of the scaffolding and the support and the entries and the sequences that get you there. And also, I presume, what to do if it fails or if you have to adjust midway through.
Exactly, yeah. So, a big part of that is the problem-solving process that we talked about earlier, where, like, if I'm using the armbar as an example, as a project, like, obviously you have to have ways to get into the armbar, right? So there's the entry phase. And if I only have one entry, then the problem is my training partners catch on pretty quick, and then they deny me that entry. And if I don't have other ways to get into that room, then I'm never going to get a chance to practice that armbar at all, because people will just shut me out. So the first phase is just developing as many entries into it as possible. And that's like, just gathering information and trying to find even like the dumb entries that you think like, this is so stupid, I don't think it would ever work. You still try it and you just see like, okay, I've tried 15 different entries into the armbar. Now let me sort through the ones that I have some success with, sort through some of the ones that I feel like might have potential if I put some elbow grease into it, and then let me trim off the ones that are just absolutely horrible and don't work at all. And then that gets me into the armbar position. And then I have to find out, okay, well, how are people going to get out of this if I'm controlling an armbar? And then, the finishing phase, which is how would I efficiently finish the armbar? And if I can't finish it, would I move on to something else? And if they escape from it, like you said, having a backup plan.
Makes sense. Now, I am going to assume that when your students are in their training, some of the things that might be good answers for one person might be bad answers for another person. You talked about how part of the goal here is for students to assess which entries, for instance, work for them and which ones don't. I'm going to guess that for Bob, maybe some entries work really well, but for Jane, maybe the same entries don't work that well, and maybe she's got alternate pathways. Do you find that, or do you find that kind of the same entries are universal for most of your students?
I think that there are some entries that, like, if you have a student spectrum from, like, you know, somebody who is maybe 80 years old and weighs like 110 pounds, and then you have somebody who's 20 years old and is 220 pounds and super athletic, and you have all those shades of gray in between, like what people are physically capable of doing and what they're mentally capable of doing and all that. I think there's some entries that fit pretty nicely into what most people can do. And then once you start getting to the ends of the spectrum where it's like, okay, this person is, you know, maybe a 42-year-old, they're 120 pounds, they're training with people that are 180 pounds or 190 pounds all the time and are way more athletic than this person. I can't really expect that 120-pound person to, like, mount most of their training partners and push both of their elbows above their head and then arm bar the same way that Gordon Ryan would. So then they would have different entries. But I think there's some entries that are kind of universal, don't work for every single person, but work for the majority. And then once we get to the sort of edge cases, it's a little bit easier to, like, branch out and say, okay, well, you know, this one would work great for you, but it probably wouldn't work for anybody else. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Something that's a real game changer for most people is when they stop thinking of jiu-jitsu techniques as being individual, isolated things and start thinking about how they all connect to each other. And one of the things that you often find is you may have several different entries to a technique, but maybe even if they're all relatively good in general, one or two of them may be better for you because of your specific game, because they're more likely to take you where you want to be. This is something that a friend of yours and a friend of mine, Nelson Puentes from Inverted Gear.
Nelson's awesome.
Yeah. He's referred to it as funneling, the idea that you're trying to kind of take your game and steer it towards where you want to go. And this is where I can see something like project-based jiu-jitsu being very helpful. If you, for example, are a butterfly guard player, then that can inform a lot of the techniques that you do, because if you have techniques that will land you up in butterfly guard, or maybe if they fail, they're easy to recover into butterfly guard, that might be preferable to you because it takes you to your strong suit. Even if for other people, they might not necessarily like that technique because it doesn't take them where they want to go. That's always a consideration that for me, I found very helpful when working out a game plan, is not just do I like this technique, but how can I get into it? Does it align with the other things I'm good at and that I like to do? Do I have an entry path? And also, if the technique fails, where am I going to wind up? Is it going to put me in a position that I'm strong at playing, or is it going to put me in a position that I'm not very good at?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that's kind of, you know, basically you're describing kind of the entry phase. So we're talking about the same thing, really. If you and Nelson are using the term funneling, then that's basically just how do I find different entries into that butterfly guard. So I could do that from bottom of half guard. I could do that from bottom of the mount with a kipping escape. I could do that from, you know, a bunch of different places. So it's just kind of finding all those entry points and then keeping the ones that give you the highest rate of success and then just trimming off the ones that are not really working out for you.
Now, when you're working all of this out, are you a metrics guy? Do you think there's any point in tracking or trying to do statistical analysis on which techniques work for you and which don't? The reason I ask is because there's a lot of people out there, especially more junior, more enthusiastic people who I presume have more time on their hands, who like to track every little detail in a spreadsheet. So what they're doing, what's working in the gym, what's not. And then they try to moneyball their jiu-jitsu, for lack of a better word, to kind of figure out which of their techniques are working at the highest percentage and which ones aren't. Since you're organizing your training into projects, I can imagine that people might tack this on as part of that project to try to do like an analysis on what's working and what isn't. I'm wondering if you've ever had any benefit or found any benefit to doing that, or if you think it's just overkill.
So I like the idea of being very metrics based, but I'm also kind of lazy with that kind of stuff. And, you know, like part of it is that, for example, like about maybe 10 years ago, I decided I was going to watch 100 black belt matches on YouTube or, you know, just wherever I could find them, and then try to figure out like, okay, well, what are the most common guard passes that I see people doing in different weight classes in black belt competition? And so I started going down that like statistical analysis route in that way. And then I got some good results from that. But then the problem is that I feel like that has to be balanced out with like a little more like a relaxed statistics kind of thing where you're not like, okay, well, I saw the long step pass, almost successful 82 times, but I saw a completely successful 27 times, that means that I'm going to give it a percentage of success rate of this, this, and this. I think it has to be a little bit looser than that, because there are a lot of things in jiu-jitsu that don't fit into that statistical framework. Like you could say that Kyotera footlock has a low statistical success rate because not that many people do it, so you can't find a ton of examples of it. And yet all of a sudden I'm seeing it pop up on Instagram in competition footage all the time now. And so if I just looked at the statistical numbers, I wouldn't think that it'd be worth spending any time on. But does that kind of make sense? It's like a mixed approach where you're like, I want to look at the numbers, but I don't want to overly focus on the numbers because I just don't have the energy to go through all that and make everything as pure metrics as possible. But then also, I don't think it's useful to go too deep down that rabbit hole. I think there's a healthy balance between finding appropriate metrics where, like, if I'm doing my arm bars, I have success entering the arm bar, let's say 7 times out of 10 with most of my training partners using this particular entry, then I'll stick to that entry. But I don't every single training session have to write down that, okay, today I was 6 times out of 10. Tomorrow I was 7 times out of 10. On Tuesday I was 4 times out of 10. It's more just like, I'm mostly successful here, so let me keep on doing that.
You're talking about project-based jiu-jitsu here, and it's interesting because it reminds me of actual on-the-job project management. And you see some of the same issues where it is possible to overanalyze and over-document things to your own detriment. I think it's very appealing to new people, especially, to try to document everything they're doing, to take copious amounts of notes, to track and log everything that happens in the gym, and to try to do almost a statistical analysis on their performance. And I have certainly done this myself. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing necessarily. Sometimes people get a lot of value out of it. I have gone through that process where I've tried to log everything, but I find there is very much a point of diminishing returns there. You might get some value out of it at first because it can help you see patterns that maybe you didn't see before. And sometimes just the act of writing things down helps reinforce your learning and your memory. So I find that the practice of plotting that out can be helpful, but it can very easily get to the point where you're spending 1 hour a day actually training jiu-jitsu and 3 hours a day reviewing your notes, which is probably not the best use of your time. So you have to be careful not to get yourself in an analysis paralysis trap. And it's interesting because in project management, the same thing happens, and the same problem can occur where people get so focused on creating the perfect project plan and creating all of the documentation and making sure everything is written down. They can get so focused on that it takes away from actually doing the work. There's this give and take of how much time do I want to spend analyzing and planning versus how much time do I want to spend actually doing. And I think that whenever you're building a project, you have to make sure that you bear in mind the purpose of a project is not to have a great plan. The purpose of a project is to get something done. And so if you ever get yourself into a situation where you're planning so much that the act of planning is taking away from the doing, that means you probably have a priority mismatch there.
Yeah, it's like, I think, sort of soft metrics is a nice way to put it, because there's also a motivation aspect to it too, right? Like if I'm doing a project and I'm spending, like you said, an hour after every training session categorizing and writing down, okay, 7 times out of 10 I was successful against this person, and I have a 42% success rate if I use this particular grip. It gets overwhelming. It also turns into a second job. And for a lot of people, they want to go to jiu-jitsu and they want to get better, but then they also have to balance out the motivation aspect. And it's like, if they go in and they're working on something that's motivating and exciting and sort of gets them going on the mat, and then they know afterwards, I got to do all this paperwork afterwards and write down like, dang, like against Jeff, I got it 2 times out of 10. It turns something that would be motivating and exciting and inspiring into something that's like, just another job. And you already worked 40 hours that week. And do you really want to do more work at jiu-jitsu?
That's a really great point, and something that people often lose when they're trying to think of how to train at the highest levels, for instance. I saw a thread on Reddit some time ago where someone was saying, well, look, if there's all of these great modern coaching practices that all of these elite grapplers use, how come we don't see them in every gym in the world? How come we don't have every gym doing the kind of training that you would do under Danaher or something like that? And someone replied and said, because if everyone trained like that, the 99% of people in jiu-jitsu who just come for fun and aren't interested in being the best in the world, they would get out of here. they wouldn't want to do it. And that's because it's not fun anymore. A lot of the things that you would do if you want to be the absolute best in the world, they basically turn jiu-jitsu into a job, because at that point it is a job. And I think sometimes people forget that most of the people training jiu-jitsu don't want it to be a job. They come here because it's fun, and it being fun is kind of the paramount thing that keeps people here. And if you turn it into a job, then you run the risk of losing the majority of your students. And those are the ones who are ultimately going to wind up paying the bills for you. So that's something that I think sometimes we lose sight of when we try to hyper optimize to figure out how can we all train like the absolute best. And we forget that most people, they don't want jiu-jitsu to be a job. Yes, they want to be good at this. And yes, they want to see improvement, but they want to do it 2 hours a week while they're having fun. And if they never medal, that's fine. They might not even want to compete. They're here for different purposes. And I think sometimes if we look at things all through the lens of what works at the competition meta, we lose sight of that. So I really like this idea of project-based jiu-jitsu because it lets you set individualized goals for each of your people. And that means that it can always be fun for those people because they have their own plan for how to make it fun.
Yeah. And sometimes, like for me, for example, when I do my own projects also, and so when I'm doing a project, like there's times where I'm in like metrics mode, like, okay, I want to be very, scientific and organized and et cetera about it. And then there's maybe the next week, I'm not feeling like that. I want to be more artistic about it. So I still have that same project. I can still sort of get some soft metrics on what works, what doesn't work. But then maybe the next week I'm feeling a little bit more, I don't know, lighthearted. I need to have some fun in my life. So maybe I go to open mat and I still work on my project, but I take a more like lighthearted and fun sort of artistic approach to it. And just sort of, maybe I do more positional sparring and I see what kind of solutions just organically emerge out of the positional sparring. And then maybe the following week I'm back in like science and metrics mode again, where like, okay, I'm going to do positional sparring, but I'm going to I'm going to videotape all my sessions and I'm going to study exactly what grip my partner used to stop my berimbolo. And then I'm going to find a way to counter that. And I think there's just that, I think motivation and enjoying yourself. Sometimes I don't think it's the same thing for everybody all the time either. Like there's some people like that are very metrics oriented all the time. But I think most people kind of go back and forth where they need a lighthearted approach sometimes, and they need to have more like a serious approach sometimes. And I think, if you have a project, I think there's room for both of those approaches, but I think you can't get too locked into only one way of doing things.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs you have come through playful experimentation. There's a lot of stuff that I've adapted into my game, not because anyone told me or taught me to do it, and not because I studied high-level grapplers doing it, but because I was just goofing around at the gym.
Yeah.
And I tried something and I realized, like, holy smoke, this actually works. I mean, as an example, mostly because I'm just a dumbass, for fun, for a long time, and still to this day, I always try to Ezekiel people from inside their guard, just to be a goof, right? But what I've found is, I'm not going to sit here and tell the world that the Ezekiel from the guard is this super high percentage technique. But what I found is, by doing stuff like that, it allowed me to develop a very unique pressure game from inside the guard that people don't expect. So even if I'm not going for Ezekiels from inside the guard, I got a lot of practice learning how to put just hellacious pressure down on people when I'm in their closed guard, forcing them to give it up, forcing them to open it. And I don't know if I would have developed those pathways if I was just kind of copying what I was watching on instructionals. There's a lot of stuff that comes out of experimentation. And I kind of worry sometimes when people try to build their entire game around what they see from instructionals. They sometimes lose that aspect of innovation that lets them make jiu-jitsu uniquely their own. And that's where a lot of the big growth comes from, not just for yourself, but also for the sport as a whole. I mean, the reason that jiu-jitsu keeps evolving is because grapplers keep trying cool things and they keep finding new things that work. So I always encourage people that, yes, you want to be training intelligently and you don't want to build your game around meme techniques, but at the end of the day, you do want to experiment and be playful and not be afraid to try some things that might seem a bit silly.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, I mean, I think, that Ezekiel from top of closed guard, right? Like if somebody sent that to you on Instagram, you might look at it and be like, look at this dumb shit. But then you try it out and you're like, okay, well, I could hit this every once in a while on some people. Maybe it catches a couple people by surprise. But then I discovered all this other cool stuff just by goofing around with something that I thought was stupid. And maybe I can take those things that I learned from that, like you were talking about pressure from top of the closed guard, then maybe you can take that pressure from closed guard and apply it to your Sao Paulo pass and make that Sao Paulo pass better. But you wouldn't have discovered that unless you goofed around with something that seems, on the surface might look silly or might not. Somebody else would be like, that's not high percentage. Why are you wasting your time with that? And I think that kind of gets back to what you were talking about earlier about like that idea that people want to maximize everything in their jiu-jitsu for like the optimal performance at every second. And that really sounds good on paper, but I don't think people work like that. Like, I think there's like, you want to have stuff that works, but I think that creativity keeps people engaged and keeps people having fun in jiu-jitsu, and that's what keeps people coming back in the door. So even if it's not like the most optimal training practices or the most optimal techniques at all times, if it gets somebody in the door who might have otherwise gotten burnt out by training in an optimal way all the time, then that's good, because like motivation is what gets people in the door, not having like the perfect training practices every time.
Yeah, the pursuit of the perfect training practice has burned a lot of people out. There are many, many people who they lost their love of jiu-jitsu, not because they're bad at it or not because they had a bad experience, but because they have this idea in their head of how perfect they should be, and they can never achieve that perfection.
Yeah.
Very, very common for people in jiu-jitsu to just be hypercritical of every mistake they're making and feel like they're not good enough or they're losing too much, often not realizing that that's part of the recipe. We all lose. That's how we get better. We practice, and it is the losing that actually gives us the best feedback about how we can improve the next time. So it's very easy to get into this cycle of just, I hate jiu-jitsu because I'm trying to emulate what the 0.001% best grapplers are doing, and I can't do what they do. That's really just a recipe for misery, I think. At the end of the day, focusing on your own path is always going to be more helpful. And I can see that a project would be a good way to do that. Walk me through how this would look. I mean, if I were to walk into your gym, if I'm I don't know, maybe not a white belt, but let's say that I'm a blue belt and I'm sitting down with you and we want to carve out a project. How would we actually do that? How would we action that? And what would that look like?
Okay, so I had a student come to me yesterday who's a blue belt. He competed about a month ago, and he was in competition. He is a closed guard, spider guard player. He also does straight ankle locks. And he came to me yesterday and he said that he wanted to work on wrestling up to single legs from bottom of half guard as a project. And so my suggestion to him was, well, okay, first thing I asked was that a situation that you ran into that would have solved the problem that you came across in this tournament? Like, would wrestling up from half guard have helped you perform better in the tournament that you just did? Would it have solved any issues that you came across? And he said no. And so I was like, okay, well, if you want to wrestle up, that's fantastic. Maybe try it from open guard. Find ways from your spider guard to wrestle up to a single leg. And then that'll give you a chance to like kind of work the stuff that you wanted to work on, but also solve a problem that you came across in the tournament where you got your open guard passed. So that would be one example of how I would steer somebody in direction to like what kind of project to pick. If it's a non-competition example, then usually knowing the person's game, I'll try to identify something that I think is a weak spot that they really should fill up. So for example, if it's somebody who's got a fantastic open guard, but then when they get their open guard passed, they have, lackluster bottom of side control escapes and they tend to turtle and give their back up and get choked, then for them, I would suggest that, their next project be something like escaping from bottom of side control back to their open guard, or if they turtle, developing a better turtle position so that then they can recover back to their guard. If it's somebody who doesn't have any clear direction, that like if I know them and I don't see anything that really stands out as something that they need to work on, then I'll kind of default back to my belt promotion standards, where it's like for white belt to blue belt, I would like to see this. Where it's blue to purple, I would like to see this. So that sort of belt promotion standard gives me a technical guideline that I can use, just sort of like, if this person doesn't obviously need anything else, then let's just go back to the belt promotion standard. Got
it. And just to clarify, when you talk about belt promotion standards, it sounds like you're saying you don't necessarily care if they know how to do this particular lasso sweep from spider guard. You care more that this person has an answer from this position, whatever that best answer would be for them. So it could vary just as long as they have a solution they found that works for them. Is that correct?
Exactly. Like the whole belt promotion standards that we have set aren't based on people learning any specific techniques. My goal is that by the time somebody's a black belt, that they have an understanding of the entirety of jiu-jitsu, meaning like standing phase, top of some kind of guard, bottom of some kind of guard, pinning, sweeps, submissions, all the like basic ingredients of a jiu-jitsu style grappling game, and that they can problem solve intelligently their own game and they can teach themselves jiu-jitsu. So if I'm going from white belt to blue belt, the belt promotion standard is having one technique from every major position, because that gives them an organized way to fill in all the buckets of standing, top of guard, bottom of guard, top of side control, bottom of side control, and they know they have something that they can try to do. When they go from blue to purple belt, it becomes more about the problem solving process. So I don't care if they know how to X choke from bottom of closed guard, but I do care that if they're on bottom of some kind of guard position, they have a plan, and that they have two solutions for every problem that they come across in that position. And then they have a specialty position that they're exceptional at.
Got it. And as part of that process, do you audit how all of these things tie together? So for example, if someone's got techniques from bottom close guard, but they don't have anything that kind of funnels into or out of those techniques, is that something that you also optimize for? Or are you just looking to make sure they've got an answer regardless of how they get into it?
Yeah, so at a certain point, I want to make sure that their game harmonizes. And so, for example, if their chosen guard is bottom of closed guard, and let's say they're an armbar player from bottom of closed guard, then at some point, I want to make sure that their escapes from bottom of side control, for example, lead them back to closed guard. So if it's somebody who is a bottom of closed guard player, but all of their side control escapes are just reversals that put them on top of side control, then that doesn't really lead them, that doesn't funnel them back into the game that they're developing. So I want to make sure that their game harmonizes where, if they are a closed guard player, they start from the feet and they have a guard pull that will get them back to closed guard. If they get their closed guard passed, they have a way back to closed guard.
Yeah. Now, is there ever a point, though, where you as the coach have to intervene and actually correct the project plan because you just feel that the student has kind of come up with the wrong plan? Let's say, for example, that you sit down Bob and you say, Bob, I think it's great that you have a project plan, but your whole game of trying to sacrifice choke everyone from bottom side control is not optimal. We need to get you on the right path. Does that ever happen? Or do you believe that people should just choose whatever plan works for them, even if on its face it doesn't necessarily make sense or it's not high percentage?
I try to encourage people, like when it comes to people who are recreational students and they're coming in to enjoy jiu-jitsu as a practice, I'll give gentle recommendations like, okay, if you're doing Ezekiel chokes from bottom of the mount position and that's your project, you're probably going to get armbarred a lot from there while you're working on that. So you might want to work on something else. And if they really are into it and they really want to pursue that, I'm not going to give them a hard time about it. I'll try to do my best to help them build a system out of Ezekiel chokes from bottom of the mount position. And then I'll, sort of let them discover on their own that they're going to get armbarred a whole bunch, or maybe I'm wrong. And maybe all of a sudden they develop this really cool bottom of the mount position Ezekiel system that I had never encountered before. So I'll gently encourage them in another direction if I see that it's something that, doesn't really have any chance whatsoever of working. And if they insist on it, cool, do you, I'll do my best to help you. That's my, I want to see you do well, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe you'll prove to me that there's something good there. If it's somebody who I know that either is, competing and they have a high standard for themselves or high expectations, or if it's somebody that I know personally that really, really wants to get good at jiu-jitsu and they want to, they're more of like the maximizing their training time kind of person, then I'll encourage them and say, listen, this is not going to work for you. I think you should probably try it this way. And then if I meet resistance, for example, I had one student who came from another school, and when she started, she was doing something that I didn't think was a good fit for her, that she learned from her previous instructor. And rather than saying that thing is not a good technique, I would show her like, okay, well, maybe this is a better way to do it. And then I kind of let her discover on her own that, it's more gentle guidance than anything else.
Yeah, I think that's very important because you as the instructor can never really know for sure what's going to work or what won't work for a student. And a frustration that I have had as a student is many instructors over the years trying to insist that I do things a certain way because for them, it was the optimal solution and they were able to make it work. But for me, I just found other ways to achieve the same thing. And I think that's a mistake that even to this day, too many instructors make, trying to expect that their students become carbon copies of themselves, which isn't even really a healthy thing to encourage. You want people to branch out and try their own stuff. And yes, you should give them the chance to prove you wrong. Maybe they can do things and build games around things that you didn't think were optimal. Maybe they can find a way to make that work. I really don't think it's the job of the instructor to gatekeep jiu-jitsu and tell people what they can and can't do. So I think it's good to take out that gentle guidance approach because it does leave open the possibility that you as the instructor may have misread the situation and maybe they actually can make this work.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've been in the game for a long time, right, Steve? And how many times over the course of your jiu-jitsu career have you gone through that kind of like edgy phase where you see something and you're like, this is total bullshit. It'll never work, right? And then maybe a year later, you see everybody hit it in competition and you're like, holy shit, I was so wrong about that, right? And then eventually you get to a point where you're like, okay, I've been wrong a whole bunch of times about this stuff. Maybe I shouldn't be so judgmental about other people's jiu-jitsu. Even if it's something that seems just so silly and so far-fetched, and maybe even in your own head, you still are like, it's probably not going to work. Like, as far as being an instructor, I think it's more useful to maybe guide people in a direction that you think is more productive. But if they really want to work on something, then do your best to help them and then be pleasantly surprised if you were wrong about the technique.
Yep, sounds great. Now, resource-wise, do you encourage people to fill in templates or worksheets or notebooks or anything like that? Do you have a structure for that? And I just ask this because people often ask me if there are resources out there for planning out their game or putting together a project plan for jiu-jitsu. Everyone has different solutions here and different ways that they do things. I'd just be curious to know if you have one.
Yeah, so basically, I occasionally show my students, we have TVs on our mats, so I'll pull up some of the flowcharts that I use to organize different games that I'm trying to develop. And then I'll show them hey, this is how I do it. I might use a flow chart to show if I'm working on berimbolo, I do daily Hiva guard, off balance, their hips touch the mat, I invert, and then here's a problem they pose. And I can show them how to map out a clear path to the destination of taking the back and then show some of the problems that I come across. And here's how I organize that in a flow chart format. And then my wife, she does it a little differently where she takes notes in her own way, which is, more of what you would see in a high school project where it's okay, the Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, 4, you try this, they do this, they do this. And so we'll both share those things with our students to give them ideas of ways that they could take notes on their own, but we don't really push it too much on them. And then when we do see students that are interested in taking notes, or maybe they ask more about it, then I'll try to encourage them in their own way to take notes. Some of them might enjoy drawing pictures of the techniques or positions instead of doing flowcharts. So whatever method gets them where they need to go, we'll try to encourage them, and then we just give them ideas of what they could try.
Yeah. As the saying goes, plans are useless, but planning is essential, right? And I think that that's an important thing to understand. I have yet to find a note-taking or diagramming or planning method that I can do on paper which would accurately reflect how jiu-jitsu works. There's a lot of different solutions, like you said, flow charts or bulleted lists. There's many different approaches you could take, but jiu-jitsu itself has so much variability and chaos that I have yet to find a way to write down a game plan or a strategy and have that map exactly to what you're doing on the fly. And I think sometimes people think if I could just document the perfect flow chart, I would be amazing at jiu-jitsu. I've found that there really isn't a good match between that kind of tool and how things actually work on the ground. But that said, the act of planning can be tremendously helpful. Because even if you never use that flow chart, or even if you never go back and consult those notes again, the act of sitting down and writing it down will force you to run through the scenarios in your head and identify holes, things that you haven't considered, or maybe technical mismatches. You talked earlier about not having a proper sequence. As an example, I've given this example on the podcast before. I used to be terrible at things like single leg X guard, and I really wanted to get good at them. And for a long time, I just kept working on the single leg X guard sweeps and techniques, and I just couldn't make it happen. And then at some point, I realized the problem is not my single leg X guard ability. My problem is that I don't have good consistent entries into single leg X guard. That's what I have to work on. And things like that tend to emerge when you sit down and actually plan things out. So I found that the act of planning can be very beneficial because it forces you to think through everything. And there's just something about putting pen to paper. It makes you really engage and pay attention in a way that you might not do if you're just brainstorming in your head. But once you create those artifacts, I often wind up just discarding them. And I find that the actual plan itself, I can't rely on because it's going to be incomplete. It won't capture the nuances and the chaos of reality. So it really doesn't actually help me to have the plan, but the process of making the plan is very helpful. That at least has been my experience.
Yeah, and you start to see patterns, right? So for example, with your single leg X, like, okay, you get through the entry phase and you finally get there. And then when you're in single leg X, like theoretically, there's an infinite number of things that people could do to get out of single leg X, right? But on a practical level, most people are going to try to push your outside foot out of the hip. They're going to try to shove their inside knee between their legs to pass to like some sort of quarter guard, or they're going to push the outside foot out of the hip and they're going to back step and try to go to like reverse knee on belly or something like that. Like there's if you start flow charting or mapping or taking notes, like you'll notice that there are certain predictable patterns that happen, and it's not perfect every time. But, you're making a map of the territory, and the map is not the actual thing. The map of New Jersey is not actually New Jersey, but you can sort of get a sense of, if you're looking at a map of New Jersey in a neighborhood, and you can get a sense that the UPS guy usually shows up at 4 p.m. Monday through Friday, even if it's 3:58 or 3:57, still around 4 p.m. You get a general sense of the patterns. And so from single leg X, you start to see like, okay, well, yeah, there are an infinite number of things that somebody could do on a micro level, but generally they're going to do one of three different things to try to get out of it. They're going to try to rip out, they're going to peel the foot off the hip, they're going to stuff the knee, or they're going to back step over to like reverse knee on belly or knee on belly. And then you can kind of see those patterns more clearly if you make those maps or flow charts or note taking, and then you kind of know where to put the majority of your energy when you're actually practicing single leg X. So if you're doing a project on that, you don't have to spend time worrying about every single picayune problem. You can just focus on those three major problems, and that covers like 80% of the problems you're going to come across during open mat.
That's a really good point. Something that I've said about jiu-jitsu in the past is that it's not so much about the positions or the techniques. It's more about creating certainty for yourself, or as close to certainty as you can get. When we're doing jiu-jitsu and we're advancing up the positional hierarchy and we're trying to go from passing the guard to knee on belly or to mount or to back control, a big part of the reason we do that is to tip the scales of probability in our favor. It's not necessarily that I want to be sitting on top of you. It's more that I want to be in a situation where I can control the probabilities of this fight. I've got a lot of really good options, and you only have a few predictable options, and most of them are bad. That's where I want to be, right? I'm trying to stack the deck in my favor. If we're in a neutral position, like we're both standing up, there's just open season, open variability, anything could happen. But if I put you on the floor and then I mount you, I can do a lot of things. You can do maybe 3 things, and most of those things are going to be bad for you. So this is something that I found when it comes to how I plan out my game and what I'm doing. Rather than trying to create the perfect flow chart, often I'm looking at a scenario and thinking, what are the things that my opponent can do here? What are the predictable responses? And what answers do I have for each of those? And I find that that's just a very simple way for breaking down and analyzing a position. You don't have to know everything about a position or a submission. You just need to know, what are the things that my opponent is likely going to do, and can I answer those questions if they pose them?
Yeah, and that's like, that's what's interesting about that is that, for example, using your single leg X example, if you're in the entry phase, let's say you and I are starting and you're seated and I'm standing and we're disconnected from each other, right? Well, you could do 1,000 different entries in a single leg X, and I could try to counter those in 1,000 different ways. And so we're both totally unpredictable at that point. But as soon as you connect shin to shin, then the game becomes predictable. So there's like maybe 40 different things you could do from shin to shin, and maybe 40 different ways that I could try to pass and disengage and do all that kind of stuff. And then you start to fall onto your side and kick through for single leg X. And then all of a sudden, it went down to maybe 15 different things. The variables start to get smaller and smaller. And so what you'll notice is that from the entry phase to the control phase, the game gets more and more predictable. And then from the control phase to the finish phase, it gets even more predictable. So it's easier to have like in the entry phase, you try to find a whole bunch of different entries, but it's so complicated that you kind of have to have entries, but then you also kind of have to rely on just general heuristics. Like, okay, I have to get in between their legs to get single leg X. And then when you get to entry phase, you can rely less on heuristics and more on specific things like I'm controlling the position. They're probably going to try to rip away from me, peel the foot out of the hip, stuff the knee, or back step over to reverse knee on belly. And then when you're in the finishing phase, if you're trying to do a straight ankle lock from single leg X or a heel hook, their hips are on the mat, you have the heel exposed, they're going to try to roll away from you. And that's like one thing they're probably going to do. And so it gets simpler and simpler, I think, the deeper you get into that entry control finish phase model.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because that's exactly how I optimized my single leg X game. I used to be thinking 2 feet away from this person, how do I do a single leg X guard sweep? And I couldn't make it work. But when it started working for me was when I realized my goal should not be to worry about the single leg X guard sweep at this point. My goal is how can I get shin to shin on this person without getting choked or without getting passed? How can I get in there safely so that I don't give anything up? Because once I get to shin on shin, now I've got some control, and getting to single leg X guard or doing something else is not that difficult. So I found that breaking things up into those phases was tremendously helpful. It allowed me to focus on what I really needed to achieve, which was not getting this particular sweep, but getting to a good position where I have control.
Yeah, as an instructor, it's interesting because earlier you asked about how if I can remember all my students' different games and stuff like that, and that ties into organizing jiu-jitsu that we talked about earlier, and the entry control finish phase model is what makes it a lot easier for me to remember people's games, and it makes it a way more fun for me because for me, like as an instructor, I kind of look at my job just as like I have to be an encyclopedia of problems. So if I have, let's say I have 20 students in my projects class and all of them are working on something completely different. If I was just trying to freestyle answers randomly for all the stuff that they're coming across in that class, it would be completely overwhelming. But if I can see every project that somebody's doing and more or less have a sense of like, okay, this is the most likely entries that they're going to try. This is the most likely problems during the control phase. And these are the most likely problems during the finishing phase. Then I don't really have to like freestyle answers for their problems. I already have like an information packet in my head of Steve's working on single leg X. He's probably going to do shin to shin, or maybe do a kipping escape from bottom of the mount position. Those are 2 different entries. And then when he gets to the control phase, his partner's probably going to do this, this, and this. And so it gets easier to remember, but it also is super fun for me because then when I look at competition footage or I do my own studying on the side for my students, I get a chance to just constantly upgrade my encyclopedia of problems. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, we covered a lot here, Josh. Before we tie this up, any closing thoughts or things you wanted to ask or talk about or even plug? Anything that we didn't get to in this conversation?
Oh, man. Steve, you're fun to talk to, man. Like, I would spend all day talking about stuff. I think maybe the only other thing would be a little bit about the periodization thing, where, one of the other ideas that I like about my own personal jiu-jitsu and I try to encourage people to do is periodize their own jiu-jitsu training, meaning, okay, I'm 45 years old. I train jiu-jitsu full time. I train 2 or 3 times a day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. And when I used to do that without organizing my own personal schedule, my own training, I used to get real close to getting injured all the time. I would get burnt out. My body was hurt all the time. And so what I started doing was organizing my training into just a basic periodization scheme like they would use in weightlifting. So I have a light week, I have a little bit of a harder week, I have a harder week, and I have like crazy hard week where I'm just burning the candle at both ends. And then after that, I do a deload week to recover. And then I start my next week 1 at a slightly higher point. So the same way they do in weightlifting. So if you want to dig into that a little bit, or if not, we can talk about whatever.
I think maybe we should pause and we could have a whole separate conversation on that, actually. I love the idea of periodization. The thing I like about it is that when you break your schedule down and you pre-plan out your training sessions, it takes a lot of the training guilt out of the equation. People often beat themselves up because they're thinking, oh, I should be training right now. Why am I not training right now? I need to put as much time as possible on the mats. That doesn't always make things better for reasons that you alluded to. And if you take the alternate approach of planning out your training schedule and adhering to that, then a lot of that guilt goes away because you've made a commitment to yourself and you just follow that plan. Now you're just following the process. But I think that's probably a bigger conversation for another day, though. Why don't we come back at some point, because we can definitely reapproach that. One thing I did want to ask you about before we closed off, Josh, I understand that you've got an instructional on your project-based jiu-jitsu approach on BJJ Fanatics, correct?
Yep, that's it. It's called 90-Day Project-Based Jiu-Jitsu by Josh Vogel on BJJ Fanatics. And it's been out for a couple months. And yeah, I mean, it basically is just a detailed outline of all the stuff that we discussed in this podcast, but also, goes a little bit deeper into it, how to organize your training into a 90-day schedule, how long you should spend on each phase of training, entry, control, finish, different things that you can use as tools to source solutions and problems, like different types of positional sparring, situational sparring, drilling, stuff like that.
Awesome. And for people out there who are feeling kind of lost in their training, people sometimes hear our podcast and we talk about things like training with purpose, having goals when you go into class. And sometimes people don't know, where do I even start with something like that? I think an instructional like yours is a really good resource for giving that a go, having a way to get the ball rolling on how to come up with a plan for what you want your training to look like. So if you've ever struggled with, man, I want to put together a plan, but I don't even know where to start, I would definitely recommend starting with a resource like Josh's. I'll put a link in the show notes to that instructional to make it easy for people to find. But Josh, anything else you want to plug? Where's your gym if people want to come train with you?
So yeah, the last thing I wanted to say about the instructional was that when you go on BJJ Fanatics or any other instructional site, where you learn technical information, YouTube, whatever, the problem is that it's hard to take the information and then in an organized way, bring that and turn it into performance on the mat. So my goal with 90 Day BJJ was to serve as almost like a Rosetta Stone to translate the information that you see on an instructional into a training plan that you can then use in order to get better at the stuff that you're watching on the instructional.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. A problem that so many people have is not that they don't have the information, but that they don't know what to do with it. There was a quote I heard a while ago that if all people needed was more information, we'd all be billionaires. And I think that's kind of apt because there's no shortage of information. What people often need is something actionable that can get started. So I will put a link to your instructional in the show notes, Josh. Also, let's talk about the Jiu Jitsu Company. If people want to train with you, talk about your gym and how they can do that.
So you can come to the Jiu Jitsu Company in Old City, Philadelphia. The website is jiujitsuphilly.com, jiujitsuphill.com. We love having visitors, love training with everybody. And we're right in the heart of Old City. Plenty of good food, plenty of easy transportation.
Amazing. Well, Philadelphia is on my bucket list. I have never been there, but one day, Josh, it would be amazing to come by and get my ass kicked by you and your team. So
you got to come, man. We'll get some lunch.
I would love that. Well, thanks a lot, man. I will put a link to all of your stuff in the show notes, both your instructional and the information on your gym. I'll also put a link to all of our stuff. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. We've got over 300 episodes in the feed now. Every one of those is intended to be a timeless educational capsule episode, so you should be able to go back and listen to the old back catalog and still find value. A lot of people do that. They start back at episode 1 and they say it's just as helpful now as it was back when we recorded it many years ago. You can also get access to our newsletter. I definitely recommend signing up to that if you haven't already. It's free. There's a lot of great content on there, and we give away some free instructionals to people who sign up, so please do consider that as well. Beyond that, you can also check out our database of concepts, also free on our website. If you want to upgrade to our paid tier, please do check out BJJ Mental Models Premium. It is how we float the boat here, and it is the best tool that we have for working directly with you to optimize your BJJ game. If you sign up for Premium, you're going to get a bunch of stuff. First of all, you're going to get the world's biggest library of audio jiu-jitsu courses on strategy, tactics, philosophy, concepts, mental models. Definitely recommend checking that out. Presented by some of the best coaches and athletes in the sport as well. You'll also get professional jiu-jitsu podcasts exclusive to BJJ Mental Models Premium. You can even get direct coaching from quite literally some of the best black belts in the world. That's available in our coaching and pro tiers. And we're also branching out. If you're a jiu-jitsu business owner, we're looking into marketing and business support and how we can use some of the tools that we've built at BJJ Mental Models to help you accelerate your jiu-jitsu business as well. All of that is at bjjmentalmodels.com. And again, I'll put a link to all of our stuff and all of Josh's stuff in the show notes. But Josh, man, thanks so much for coming by. I'm glad we were able to make this happen, man. Exciting stuff. Thanks again.
Thanks, Steve. Have a good one, buddy.
You too, sir. And thanks to the listeners. Always appreciate everyone hanging out with us here every week. And we'll talk to you soon. Take care.